So how many of you have heard of rational basis? Probably not. It's a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and it should be to yours as well. It deals broadly with the concept of what we call law and economics, the intersection of regulation and economic thinking. And as you will see, it has a lot of impact on society, and how it is interpreted has an impact, one, on American society, the economy, as well as you individually. And there are certain challenges that rational basis has, I'm going to talk about, and some of the thinking, both in terms of jurisprudence, but also policy discussions about how to deal with the challenges of this rational basis standard. So before I get into a discussion of rational basis, I want to introduce you to how the court decides whether or not a policy is constitutional or not. So the court creates standards or interpretations of the Constitution because the Constitution does not explicitly state what certain standards are. It's very smart of the framers because they knew that new things and issues would come up, so they leave it to the judiciary, it's called judicial review, to say what the law is. So there are three basic standards that the court applies to make a determination as to whether or not a given policy is constitutional. The first is strict scrutiny. So if you have a regulation that deals with race, religion, or national origin, the government must have a compelling interest in the law, and the law must be narrowly tailored to meet that interest. Seminal case on this is Korematsu v. US. It dealt with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Very high standard. Moving down the standards a little bit, we get into intermediate basis. So things like gender and age. The standard is the law must reasonably be related to an important government interest. So for example, if you have government life insurance and the rates that people have to pay for that life insurance are different between men and women because women outlive men, that would fall under intermediate basis. Finally, and this is essentially all leftover regulation that does not deal with issues of identity, so economic regulations, you have rational basis. The law must rationally be related to a legitimate government interest. Now, what does that mean? And when you get into what the court has said in numerous cases, so long as there is a rationale articulated, the regulation is considered valid or constitutional. The rationale can be something like public safety, protecting the environment, the collective good. The rationale does not necessarily need to be valid. It simply needs to be rational in its language and relate to the goal of the policy. The thinking behind this was when governments got into the habit of enacting economic regulations, especially starting in the Great Depression, there was the need to figure out what policies worked and what didn't. So it gives a broad leeway to policymakers to enact economic regulations. The problem, though, is that it can also be exploited. So rational basis enables costly and often discriminatory regulations that can be very difficult to challenge. Because to challenge a rational basis regulation, you, the individual who can test that standard, has to prove that the regulation is arbitrary and capricious. It's a very high standard. So it's very easy to pass economic regulations. It's very difficult under the standard to challenge them. So as Thurgood Marshall stated, the Constitution does not prohibit legislatures from enacting stupid laws. The problem is that those stupid laws create conflict, they create disorder, and they get very expensive for individuals. So when we look at the economics of rational basis, because again, it relates to economic regulation, you do not need to demonstrate that the policy rationales are rooted in demonstrable reality. It's a very low standard. Rational basis does not consider the actual cost or benefit to individuals or the public at large. It also incentivizes rent seeking, which is people enacting regulations to benefit themselves, or monopolistic regulation. So I'll get into that in a minute, but it's very important. Because if you can persuade a legislature to pass a regulation that will benefit your industry, which they often do, you're basically creating a rent or a racket for yourself. Also, rational basis implicitly can be used to discriminate under the guise of economic regulation. There are many examples of this. One of them that should be near and dear to everyone's hearts, considering where we're at, is the regulation of liquor sales and prohibition. A lot of it was invoked in the name of public safety, but in fact, when you look at a lot of these regulations in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were fueled by an anti-Catholic sentiment. And they were seen as a way of discriminating against Catholics, again, under the guise of protecting the public. So here's another example. It's a particularly absurd example, but it highlights the shortfalls of rational basis, which is protecting public safety. So how many of you are afraid of margarine? You fear the margarine. The margarine is going to come and get you. You know that the margarine is margarine when you buy it. Yeah, you do. So in the name of protecting public safety, especially in the Midwest in the early part of the 20th century, dairy farmers lobbied state legislatures to pass laws requiring that margarine be dyed after purchase. So the yellow coloring is added to margarine as beta-carotene to make it look more like butter. And their rationale was, we're protecting the public. The reality of it is that the dairy farmers wanted to make it difficult to purchase margarine because they viewed it as being a competitor and they wanted to advantage themselves. So that's kind of a comical historical example, but some more recent ones highlight how expensive and politically contentious rational basis can get. So two examples from the realm of land use. Rural land use regulations. So generally speaking, these are regulations that are enacted by city dwellers because numerically that's where most population centers are, targeting regulating land use in rural areas. So in Oregon you have SB 100. It was enacted in 1973 and it severely restricts rural development in Oregon. So one of the standards that's particularly telling is on most land to build one house you have to have 160 acres to 350 acres of land. You also have to demonstrate a net revenue of $80,000 a year. Again, city dwellers that have this very pastoral view of rural life and the environment, restricting what can be done with rural property. So the net effect of this is that if you look at the census map of Oregon, so this is 1970 to 2010, the only areas that are growing are urban areas in Oregon. In fact, eastern Oregon is either flat or depopulating as a result because it's so difficult to build. Also, when you look at the political divide that has occurred in Oregon, a good chunk of the state actually wants to break away from the more populated areas and join Idaho. Same thing is true of eastern Washington as well as northern California. And again, this is because of these regulations where the economic interests of the minority are not acknowledged, and they really have no way of appealing it. Another example, and this is the inverse, so it deals with urban areas, but it's really the same problem, is recent efforts to, quote, abolish zoning in urban areas to promote higher density housing, namely done for the purpose of promoting affordability or sustainability. However, when you look at the data, it really doesn't make housing more affordable for a variety of reasons. Arguably, it isn't particularly sustainable either. It's mostly motivated by real estate investors who are flipping properties, all the while displacing people from communities that they like, and ideologically motivated planners who simply do not like the suburbs and the type of housing that most people find desirable. So again, very difficult to challenge these regulations. Now, how would we fix this? So rather than simply have a standard where you have to prove arbitrary and capricious, if you had a rational basis standard, you would have a set of standards that balance the interest of individuals against the legitimate and provable interests of the state. Also, in things like land use, you'd have a process of appeal where if you could demonstrate that a restriction could be met in terms of its goals by a less restrictive activity, then you'd use it. The court in some states is already applying the standard, so if you look towards Fall City Sustainable Growth v. King County and various investors, what the court basically said was this group that was fighting a subdivision didn't really have a claim because the developers had already proven that they were meeting the state standard with regard to rural development. One final example of rational basis and the issues that arise from it is professional licensure. So states grant a legal right to professions to self-regulate themselves. The issue with this is that when you have an interest group that has complete control over an interest, it tends to serve itself. So as Rebecca Haw-Allensworth described in her very good book, The Licensing Racket, what has happened is almost every professional group that is licensed has raised the ladder on new entrants and made it more and more difficult to become licensed as a professional. This disproportionately affects minority groups, groups that are traditionally marginalized, and so forth. It also represents rent seeking because it raises prices for those goods because they're less professionals. And it creates a lot of issues for the public and society at large. It's all, again, done in the name of protecting the public, although when you look at the evidence of the efficacy of licensing standards like professional exams and so forth, there's very little evidence that they actually protect the public. So how would you fix this? You would allow for reasonable standards for licensure to be applied that balance the interests of the licensee against the interests of the community and maintaining professional standards. This would also consider potential economic rents and other issues associated with licensing. So two examples of this is when you look at the increasing cost of healthcare, some of it can be attributed to the shortage of licensed medical professionals because the bar has been raised in such a way as to exclude many qualified entrants. And also in certain professions, there just aren't enough professionals to meet future need because current professionals are making a lot of money off of their economic rent. So a lot to think about there. The law is dynamic. And why is it important that we consider this more broadly? Why is it important that we consider our form of government, the Constitution, and so forth, is that when we look at how we exist on what I call the spectrum of action. In an ideal world, we as individuals, we wouldn't need government. We just follow our self-interest, we'd spontaneously form coalitions to get stuff done, we respect each other. It'd be very idealistic. You see libertarians talk about it, you see various collectivist ideologies talk about it, it would be great. However, humans are imperfect, we have shortcomings and failures, therefore we need government. Government facilitates collective action, it protects individual rights, it maintains order. Here is the proposition. When government, so either the operation of government or its legal structure fails, and there is an inadequacy, government fails and it brings disorder. Disorder in the form of corruption, rent-seeking, violence, and civil disorder. And I think we can all agree that that is not desirable. And rather than assume that government is static and unchangeable, or that laws are fixed and should never evolve, what this really invites us to do is go back and look at the structure of government, look at the legal system, figure out what needs to be addressed so that we can have a better system of governing ourselves and protecting both the individual and collective interests that comprise society. So thank you. And